The bar was dimly lit, filled with the sound of glasses clinking, laughter, and the low hum of a jukebox playing an old country tune. Most people came here to escape, to drown their troubles in whiskey, but on this night, something very different was about to happen. At a corner table sat an old man, his wrinkled hands clutching a worn cap with a faded military insignia stitched across it. His eyes carried the weight of battles long past, and though his back was bent, there was still a quiet strength about him. He was a veteran, someone who had given everything for his country, now sitting alone, sipping slowly at a cheap drink. Across the room, a group of younger men began to laugh, their voices sharp, mocking. One of them pointed toward the veteran, sneering at his trembling hands and his old uniform jacket. Their words cut through the air like knives, cruel and unprovoked. "Look at the old man shaking, probably can't even stand without help." "What a joke," one of them said, sparking laughter among his friends. Most people looked away, too scared to interfere, but not her. She had been sitting at the bar, quiet, unnoticed until that moment. Something in her heart wouldn't let her stay silent. She stood, her boots clicking against the wooden floor, her gaze like steel as she walked straight to the veteran's table. "That's enough," she said, her voice calm but carrying the weight of authority. The laughter stopped. The bullies looked at her, sizing her up, but she didn't flinch. She placed a protective hand on the veteran's shoulder and looked the men squarely in the eyes. "This man deserves your respect. He fought for freedoms you take for granted. If you can't honor that, then you'll answer to me." The bar fell silent. Everyone could feel the tension rising, like a storm about to break. The leader of the group sneered, stepping closer. "Lady, you don't know who you're messing with. Walk away before this gets ugly." She didn't move. Her jaw tightened, and in that moment, it was clear she wasn't going anywhere. The veteran looked up at her, his eyes glistening with both surprise and gratitude. He had grown used to being invisible, dismissed by a world that had forgotten the sacrifices of men like him. But now, someone was standing for him. One of the bullies reached out as if to push her aside, but before he could touch her, a low rumble echoed from outside. The sound was faint at first, then grew louder, filling the night with the unmistakable roar of engines. Heavy, deep, and unrelenting, motorcycles. Dozens of them. The ground seemed to shake as the noise grew nearer. The men in the bar froze, their faces paling. The woman glanced at the door, her eyes narrowing. She had heard that sound before. Within moments, the doors swung open, and leather-clad bikers began pouring in, their presence overwhelming, their eyes burning with purpose. Outside, engines still thundered. Through the windows, more headlights appeared, one after another, until every street surrounding the bar was filled with the black and chrome of motorcycles. It wasn't 5 or 10. It was closer to 80. The Hells Angels had arrived. The bullies who had been mocking the veterans suddenly weren't laughing anymore. They knew what it meant when the angels surrounded a place. There was no running, no hiding. The leader of the bikers, a towering man with a thick beard and eyes that burned like fire, stepped forward. His gaze fell first on the woman, then on the old veteran still seated at the table. Slowly, he removed his helmet and gave the veteran a nod of respect. "We heard someone thought they could disrespect one of our own," he said, his voice deep and steady. The bar seemed to shrink under his words. This man fought for this country. Some of us wouldn't be here if it weren't for men like him. And anyone who lays a hand on him, he paused, glancing toward the group of bullies who now stood frozen in fear. Lays a hand on all of us. The bullies tried to stammer excuses, their bravado shattered, but the leader of the angels raised a hand, silencing them. He turned back to the woman. "You stood up for him before we even got here. Not many would have had that courage. For that, you have our respect too." The veteran's eyes welled with tears. His voice cracked as he whispered, "I thought the world forgot us." The leader shook his head firmly. "Not while we're breathing, old man." The bikers spread throughout the bar, their presence like a wall of steel and leather. The bullies, realizing their mistake, backed out the door as fast as they could, disappearing into the night with their pride shattered and their fear plain for everyone to see. The woman helped the veteran to his feet, steadying him as the bar erupted in quiet murmurs of awe. Outside, the engines kept rumbling, a reminder of the force waiting on the streets. The leader gave a final nod to the woman, then to the veteran. "You're not alone," he said simply, before turning to leave. One by one, the angels mounted their bikes, the thunder of their engines filling the night air again. The veteran stood straighter, as if their respect had given him back some of his strength. He clutched the woman's hand, whispering, "Thank you, for seeing me when nobody else did." She smiled softly. "You deserved it." As the sound of motorcycles faded into the distance, the bar slowly returned to normal, though nothing would ever quite be the same for those who had witnessed it. The story would spread, how a woman stood up for an old soldier, and how the streets outside filled with 80 Hell's Angels ready to remind the world that respect was still alive. And the veteran, who had once thought himself forgotten, knew in that moment that he was still honored, still valued, and never truly alone. Courage is not always about fists, weapons, or the loud roar of authority. Sometimes it is as quiet as a single person choosing to stand when the rest of the room stays seated, as simple as someone refusing to look away when injustice is being done, as powerful as a voice that cuts through cruelty and says, "Enough," because courage in its truest form is the willingness to protect, even when the odds look impossible. And that night in the bar it was not the 80 Hell's Angels who first made the world stop, it was her, a lone woman who placed herself between a fragile old veteran and the mockery of cowards, because while 80 engines rumbling through the streets may have made people tremble, the first sound of defiance was her voice, steady and unwavering, a voice that told everyone present that respect cannot be abandoned, that honor is not negotiable, that no matter how forgotten someone may feel there is always the possibility that one person will remember their worth, one person will stand tall when others bow to fear, and it was her act, simple but unshakable, that turned the tide, because if she had not stood, perhaps the veteran would have sunk further into despair, believing he had truly been erased from the world's memory. But in her defiance he found his dignity restored, in her protection he found his sacrifices honored. And in her presence he realized that the fight he once gave his life to had not been in vain, because the battle for respect is fought every day in ordinary moments, and though the Hell's Angels storming the streets that night made for a spectacle no one would forget, the keynote, the beating heart of that story, was not the thunder of their engines or the fear they struck into bullies, it was the spark of humanity in her decision to stand, to shield, to remind the world that heroes are never truly forgotten so long as someone chooses to see them.